Good morning. I'm Christina Policastro. Before we start, I want to check in and make sure everyone can hear me and see my PowerPoint. If everything looks good, sounds good, let me know in your chat box. You can type me a message there to let me know if you can hear me and if you can see my PowerPoint on the screen. The chat box should be at the bottom of your little dashboard there to the right of your screen. I'll give everyone a few minutes to type in if you can hear and see me on the screen. Not me, my PowerPoint. I see in the questions, someone's posted they can see and hear me. Thank you, Leanne. All right. Thank you, Carissa. All right, so I've had a couple responses, so I want to go ahead and get started so we don't run out of time and we have the most time possible. We'll be talking about elder maltreatment, which is kind of this broad umbrella term for abuse and neglect of older adults. I want to introduce myself a little bit before we get going, so you know who I am and where I'm coming from. So my name is Christina Policastro. I'm a UC Foundation professor at the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga. I've been here about going on 3 years. I have researched elder abuse and domestic violence since I started school and throughout my professional career, going on about 10 years now. I started researching domestic violence here at UTC with Dr. Eigenberg, and when I went to Georgia State, I met Brian Payne, who is one of the leading elder abuse scholars in criminal justice, and he really got me interested in studying elder abuse because it's one of those topics that in criminal justice we don't pay a lot of attention to because much of the research shows that younger people are more likely to be victims than older individuals. And for that reason, a lot of criminal justice research, a lot of criminology research, and a lot of our policies that come out of that research in our system are focused towards young adults, not older adults. And that's because all across studies, we find that older individuals are significantly less likely to be victimized than younger people. Our largest victimization resource, the National Crime Victimization Survey, over a 10-year period from 2003 to 2013, identified that older adults, those 60 and older, comprised about 2% of all violent crimes and 2% of all serious violence. So what that means is 98% of other victimizations are experienced by younger people, particularly those in the age group of 18 to 24. So a lot of researchers use this and a lot of policymakers use this to justify why we don't focus on older adults. But this data source and a lot of the ones we use to say that older adults are less likely to be victimized are kind of limited because the NCVS is only focused on non-institutionalized populations, and we know that a lot of older adults might live in long-term care facilities. It also doesn't measure fraud, which is a significant concern to older adults when we look at that. So why is it important to study elder maltreatment and to look at it if you're a professional? Even though we think that older adults are less likely to be victimized, our population in the United States is changing significantly. It's going to change a lot over the next 20 to 40 years. The U.S. is undergoing what's called the graying of the population, and this is really attributed to our baby boomers. Our baby boomers are aging. In about 12 years, all of the baby boomers will be considered older individuals. That means they'll be age 65 and up, and that's using the government's definition of old, not mine. So the baby boomers will all be over 65. So what that also means is that by 2050, we will have over 88 million people in the U.S. who are considered elderly. That's 20% of our population. So 1 in 5 people in the U.S. will be considered older adults. This is unlike any other time period in our history. We've never seen this before. And, you know, it's going to change how our society is, how we operate healthcare, also going to have effects on crime, including abuse and neglect. Because scholars like me and others have suggested that because we have this larger segment of the population that's older, that means they're more likely to have crime occur, to be victimized. And this is an area of concern for us because when you look at the research on professionals and individuals working with older individuals, what we know they know about this problem, we know that it's limited. Researchers have looked at social workers, they've looked at health professionals, they've looked at police officers, asking questions about their preparedness to deal with older adults as victims, to respond to their unique problems. And overwhelmingly throughout that research, we found that they feel unprepared, they haven't had enough training, and they aren't aware of all the issues surrounding the problem, especially when they compare it to younger adults and what they know about younger victims. So that's a significant problem from my perspective, and I actually did a study looking at college students because that's what I deal with primarily, and we like to hope that we're sending them out into the field somewhat prepared to handle the problems they're going to encounter, especially if they're police officers, and elderly victims might be a group they encounter. And in my study, we found that regardless if they were future social workers, criminal justice majors, nursing majors, people who are going to encounter these victims, they felt they needed to know a lot about elder abuse and about reporting requirements and how to handle these victims, but they reported they knew very little, that they didn't know about mandatory reporting legislation in their area, that they didn't know how to recognize types of abuse, that they didn't know how to enforce laws related to mandated reporting. So to me, that's a major gap on our part, and one of the reasons we're here doing a webinar to kind of help increase knowledge in this area. So with all that being said, I wanted to provide you with a look at the Tennessee legal definition. I'm sure many of you have seen this before, but I think it's just helpful to look at it again. All states in the U.S. have some form of adult protection laws. That's anybody 18 and older who's considered vulnerable, including older adults. Provisions against abuse, neglect, and how those things are addressed through adult protective services. So as you look at this, I want you to keep in mind the definitions vary across states. The laws look very different as to the types of acts included and the ages at which somebody's considered to fall underneath this type of statute. So if you look here, you'll notice things like mental anguish. I like to draw attention to that one because that's unique in our law because, you know, if you've dealt with domestic violence victims, emotional abuse is not illegal. But it is mentioned here in the legislation for elder abuse. That being said, what I know from talking to lawyers and professionals, you're never going to see a case go forward under mental anguish as the offense. It's usually tacked on to other things to show the severity of abuse. And what we also know about victims is that they're often not experiencing one form of abuse. They're experiencing multiple forms, or what we call poly victims. They're experiencing, if they're experiencing physical abuse, often mental abuse is occurring as well, and typically fraud. Fraud kind of overlaps with all of them. So in Tennessee, advanced age means 60 and above. This is not an uncommon age to see in the law. Sometimes you see as low as 55, but 60 and 65 tend to be our ages at which individuals are considered older adults. All right. Oh, didn't mean to go that far. I apologize. So when we look at prevalence, how common is elder abuse? First off, I want to say we don't have many studies. Like if you compare this to studies of crime in general and studies of crime amongst just the general population. We don't have a lot of information on the experiences of older adults, particularly because of that justification. They're less likely to be victimized. And it does present some challenges for researchers when we're talking about them being a vulnerable group. Not saying all elderly individuals are cognitively impaired or physically impaired, but that risk does increase as you age. So IRBs, the boards we have to go through to research, view them as a vulnerable population. So sometimes you have to jump through hoops to research them. But what we do know, we group into prevalence of non-institutionalized, so in the general public, and those that are institutionalized, like in long-term healthcare facilities, assisted living, and things of that nature. Looking at these studies, Lawman and colleagues produced one of the largest and most cited publications looking at older adults. And interestingly, it is limited because they only looked at abuse and neglect committed by family members. And what we know is that older adults are vulnerable to all types of offenders, strangers, acquaintances, caregivers that aren't family members. But just looking at family members, they found that 9% of the sample reported verbal maltreatment, so that's emotional abuse. And that's a trend throughout the literature, is that you see verbal and emotional abuse being more prevalent than other forms like sexual victimization and physical maltreatment. So physical abuse was the least common, 0.02%, financial maltreatment, 3.5%. Another study, Acierno and colleagues, 1 out of every 10 elders surveyed, that was experienced abuse or neglect, some form. And this is a huge community sample, about 5,000 older adults. So that's a substantial number if you consider 1 in 10. But again, these are our non-institutionalized community dwelling elders. So to get a picture of our institutionalized population, I think it's helpful to know kind of how many individuals live in like nursing home facilities or other long-term care kind of settings. And what you see is that in 2015, there were about 1.3 million individuals residing in nursing homes throughout the United States, almost 30,000 in Tennessee alone during that time period. And this research is even more limited than our non-institutionalized samples, and we really rely on that official reports from Child or Adult Protective Services or police for this information. Also, the National Ombudsman reporting system. So this is reports that go to that system, and it's for any kind of complaint in nursing home facilities, not just abuse and neglect. And in 2016, they almost had 16,000 reports involving abuse and neglect or exploitation in a nursing home. And that comprised only about 8% of the complaints. So the remaining 92% were about other things. Another study looking at Adult Protective Service records by Teaster found that about 6% of cases, mistreatment cases, occurred in long-term care facilities and 2% in other types of care, so assisted living. The remainder were in the community. We really don't know a lot about what's going on in nursing homes, and underreporting is a considerable concern here and in general, because we do have research that suggests that about only 1 in 5 cases of elder abuse are reported to authorities. And some research even suggests that only 1 in 14 come to the attention of authorities. So that reporting is really important because it really affects our picture of what's going on with this population. So I want to give you kind of an overview of the different types, because those were kind of overall prevalence and a little bit of breakdown, but just to kind of know what these look like and some of the warning signs for them, I want to run through these. So probably the most visible and what most people think about when they talk about elder maltreatment is physical abuse. So punching, hitting, kicking, all those typical things that we see with physical violence can occur to older adults, but there are also some unique types. So improper use of physical restraint. So sometimes with the elderly population, they might have to be restrained for their safety, but we also see instances of that being abused. So being chained to beds, chained to furniture, so they can't physically move around, force feeding. Elderly adults can be considered physically abusive, and physical punishment. I didn't mention earlier, but a lot of times when we talk about elder abuse, it gets equated with child abuse because of this perception that both groups are vulnerable. and in need of intervention beyond those involved in the immediate situation. And kind of this draws that parallel, except the idea that children legally can be physically punished, but older adults cannot, and it's considered abusive here. Sexual abuse, which we haven't really mentioned up to this point, is identified in the literature as any form of non-consensual sexual contact with an elderly individual, so like sexual abuse broadly. It is the least commonly reported form of elder abuse, but like sexual abuse in general, we believe that it is substantially underreported and underrecognized, especially among this population. One researcher in particular, Ramsey Klausnick, has studied sexual abuse, and that's pretty much the only person you will see in the literature talking about it. And she divides it into hands-on behaviors like rape, assault, or hands-off behaviors like voyeurism, forcing the older adult to watch pornography or watch the individual engage in a sexual act, and harmful genital practices. So things that might occur while bathing the individual that's inappropriate, applying medical creams, things that are invasive in that manner, when it's kind of identified as being adequate and necessary for the older adult, but the person does it in an abusive way and takes advantage of that situation. Financial abuse is probably one of the most common forms of elder abuse there, and it falls along a continuum to least severe and more severe behaviors. So if you think about the least severe behaviors, an example could be if an older adult gives a person money to go get groceries. And when they go to get the groceries, they get $50 in change, and they don't return it to the elder. That could be considered financial abuse or financial exploitation. And then on the extreme end, you have a situation where people could wipe out an elder's entire bank account. I saw an example in a book one time of a case where an individual had abused the power of attorney, which is often cited as the most abused legal document in the United States. But an adult child had been given power of attorney over her mother, and she used all the mother's bank account to take her whole family to Disney World. Basically wiped her out as a form of financial abuse, as an example. And this can be committed by a range of offenders who have access to the elder. Psychological and emotional abuse is any infliction of anguish mentally on the individual. It could be verbal aggression, isolation, threats of abandonment or institutionalization. We could see this a lot with older adults who are frail and relying on caregivers, where the caregiver will say, if you don't give me money, and this could overlap with financial abuse, if you don't give me money, I'm going to put you in a nursing home, I'm going to put you out on the street, things of that nature. And one type is infantilization, so treating the older adult as if they're a child in a demeaning way, kind of dehumanizing them there. It's difficult to identify, but a lot of times it's indicated by symptomology like depression, anxiety, fearfulness, increased confusion on the part of the older adult. And finally, neglect and abandonment. When you look at the research, neglect is the most common form of elder maltreatment we see. This is when someone's responsible for caring for the older adult, but they fail or they refuse to provide the elder with adequate care. And this can be passive or active. So a person could intentionally do this purposefully, knowing what they're doing is neglectful, or they could do it passively. And a lot of times when we think about passively, it's unintentional, and it might be because the person's not prepared to care, or they just have inadequate knowledge. They don't know how to take care of the older adult, and they inadvertently neglect them. And one other type I'd like to mention here that's a bit controversial is self-neglect. It does fall under adult protection. This is when the elder does not take care of themselves. Maybe they don't properly feed themselves, bathe, things of that nature, take their medication. This isn't something that's criminally prosecuted, but it's something that does involve adult protective services can become involved to make sure that elderly individual is taken care of. Because oftentimes it's associated with cognitive decline like Alzheimer's or dementia. So as you can imagine, the consequences of elder abuse can be quite severe. When we talk about physical abuse and even neglect, if they're living in a dangerous living situation, we can see injuries. And there is some research to suggest that older adults are more likely to be injured if they're victimized. Health problems are another concern. There is a study of older women who have been victimized by their partners, and they have actually, Fisher and Reagan actually linked psychological abuse, so mental anguish inflicted upon these older IPV victims, to health problems. They found that older women who had been psychologically abused by their partners were more likely to have heart disease, stress-related illnesses, all kinds of things. So this does have a short and a long-term impact. And ultimately, there has been some evidence to suggest that elders who are abused are more likely to die earlier than their non-abused counterparts. So how do we kind of see, what are the risk factors? Who's more likely to be a victim of abuse or neglect? Well, what we know about elder abuse is that females tend to make up the majority of elder abuse victims, and this could be related to a number of things, including longer life expectancy of females. People who are over 80 tend to be at more risk of being abused or neglected, so our oldest of the old tend to account for over half of substantiated cases of elder abuse. We have some evidence that white elders are more likely to be victimized than elderly persons of other races, but I want to be cautious there because they do, white individuals do make up the majority of the citizenry, so we're likely to see an overrepresentation there. Other types of victim characteristics, we find that cognitively impaired elders, so those with Alzheimer's or dementia, tend to be at higher risk of being abused. One study in particular found that Alzheimer's patients were 2.25 times more likely to be physically abused than their non-impaired counterparts. So they're at a significant risk, and oftentimes this is linked to vulnerability and the idea that the abuser knows the difficulty for reporting that behavior among cognitively impaired elders. They make a very suitable target. Dependency is another risk factor, both on part of the victim and the offender. So the victim dependency, often linked to cognitive disorders, and having to rely on others for care, is a risk factor. But one researcher, Pillimer, has really highlighted how offenders who are dependent upon older adults is a risk factor, finding that abusers tend to be financially dependent. They might have a drug problem or an alcohol problem that results in them living with the elder. It's oftentimes an adult child, and that they are actually more dependent on the elder than the elder is on them. And this is a major risk factor, especially when we're talking about financial exploitation and to an extent physical abuse to maintain that power and control over the elder. Caregiver stress and burden is kind of a controversial risk factor because it shifts our attention to how stressful it is to take care of a dependent elder. And a lot of researchers have said this is a very overly simplistic explanation to say, yeah, it is stressful to care for an older adult. However, that doesn't lead people to be violent. People are stressed out all the time. It doesn't mean they're violent, have to be violent towards an older care recipient. However, the research is mixed, and a lot of people suggest that it's more than that. Oftentimes other stuff's going on, maybe alcohol abuse, depression, anxiety, all these different factors that complicate it, that it's not just the stress that's contributing to abuse. And finally, social isolation is another major risk factor. Elders who are isolated tend to be more at risk of being abused. And oftentimes it's because that abuse isn't going to be detected by anyone, and they're in a vulnerable situation. Interestingly, research has also found that elders who live with other people are at a risk of being abused, and oftentimes this is linked to those are the people abusing them, the caregiver or the family member. So context really matters there, who you live with. So it's not just you're safer if you live with someone else. All right, so now that we've kind of talked broadly about what it is, the extent and risk factors, things of that nature, I think it's important to consider how we respond to older victims, a lot of what you guys are doing and the work you're taking part in. So the major response to elder abuse is having mandatory reporting legislation. 42 states have mandatory reporting legislation for suspected cases of elder abuse, and surprise, surprise, Tennessee is one of those. So here's an excerpt from the law. And if you'll notice how our law is written in the state of Tennessee is that any person, including but not limited to these individuals, are required to report suspected elder abuse. And anytime the law says shall report, it means you must. So that's anybody, the way the law is written, is a mandatory reporter in the state of Tennessee. And to report, I have provided on this slide, now I can give these slides to the coalition to distribute should they want to, is the link to citing and to reporting in Tennessee. And you guys, I'm pulling that up now. Hopefully you can see that. What it does is it gives you, if it's an emergency, you report to 911. If not, you report to the Adult Protective Services hotline there. You can report anonymously, and importantly, like most states, Tennessee grants good faith protection. So if you're making this report in good faith and they find that it's unsubstantiated, then you're not civilly or criminally liable for that. You're not going to get in trouble because you made the report. And I think it's really interesting, the state of Tennessee, you can hover over these to see how they define abuse, neglect, and financial exploitation, and you can track your report. So in Tennessee, that's how you do that. And that report will be given to Adult Protective Services. They'll investigate, and if they feel necessary, they can involve law enforcement or the criminal justice system in that report. So Adult Protective Services is who that goes to. So they can be traced back to the 1950s, 1970s legislation that was passed. And the 1970s, Adult Protective Services was kind of mandated by the federal government. I say mandated because they tied funding to the federal funding to establishing Adult Protective Services. So the state can't get federal funding under the Social Security Act if they don't have Adult Protective Services. So all states have that. And it's any vulnerable adult, not just elders, who are covered, and this system is designed for. So it's all kind of services. They vary from state to state. And if they investigate a claim and find it substantiated, a case, then they'll provide some sort of intervention to reduce risk of violence and neglect in that situation. Unlike Child Protective Services, which this is modeled after, most of the times the client is consenting to involvement in service provision. With Child Protective Services, that isn't always the case here. We don't have a lot of research on the effectiveness of mandatory reporting legislation or Adult Protective Services. Mandatory reporting legislation in particular has been criticized. Like child abuse mandatory reporting, there's little evidence to suggest that it makes victims safer. And what we know is that reporting really depends on training of individuals and whether or not they feel comfortable reporting. We're depending on them to report. And even though a person can be held civilly and criminally liable for failure to report, a lot of times that doesn't get prosecuted. In the state of Tennessee, it's a Class A misdemeanor for violation of failure to report, which means up to $11.29 in jail and I think a $2,500 fine. So it is a misdemeanor, but a lot of times, again, you're not going to see this prosecuted, but there are penalties should that be discovered and a person was supposed to report. So I always like to kind of, when we've talked about mandated reporting and APS, to talk about how to advocate for older victims and some of the special concerns there, because older victims are a bit different from younger victims. They have special concerns. They have unique needs. They are at a different stage of their lives. So when you think about that, some of the things that might be necessary if you're a service provider is extra time may be required to encounter these individuals, to earn trust, to get information from them, to get them to be involved in services, because they are at a different stage of their life. And I'm going to skip a bullet point and come back to it, but there are generational differences. There's different views on religion, on marriage, on how to interact with society and technology. So recognizing that that might be a barrier for oftentimes younger service providers interacting with older victims is very important. Be very aware of the language you use with older adults. You don't want to treat them like children. You don't want to make assumptions that all older adults are hard of hearing or hard of sight or have disabilities that are associated with aging. So being very cognizant of that and respectful and thinking about those things to avoid stereotypes. Be aware of the complexities that surround the victim-offender relationship. Sometimes the abuser is going to be an adult child, an adult grandchild. And like with domestic violence, we know those relationships are messy. They're not neat. They often involve love and emotions. And that is something complex that, we have to recognize when we're responding to these cases, that the victim may not want to leave the situation. And if they're providing that individual is responsible for providing them with care, that complicates the situation even further. Keep in mind they may have reached out in the past and been met with resistance, or it was not a successful help-seeking experience, especially when we're talking about older victims of domestic violence. They might have tried to leave a relationship repeatedly, and barriers have existed for a long time that have helped them stay in that relationship and not escape. So what you see in the literature for this kind of helping the older victims is that we, like with the domestic violence intervention, need to seek to empower older adults who have been victims of crime. We want to see them regain control over their lives, because a lot of this victimization, the financial exploitation, the emotional abuse, the physical violence, it's disempowering. And we want to give them options in how to get help, how to maintain safe and healthy lives, not mandate services, say you have to do this. We want to give them options and choices, and for a particular path that emphasizes that we really want them to be safe and we understand the complexities around what's going on. So give them a voice back in that process. So, well, I want to thank everyone. I hope this was a good overview for you. I've enjoyed this. If you have any questions, I have a little time now, or you can always email me. You can get my information off the UTC website. Thank you so much.